The red line areas were consistently hotter by several degrees than their non-red line counterparts. And after 30 seconds of being surprised, it was like, duh, of course.
Yeah.
This has been a systematic pattern that has played out. And heat is just one indicator. It's like a spider web. You pull on one of the strands and you see the whole thing move. And it's like, heat is just one of those strands.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick, the host of Treehugger Podcast, and this is the show about the science, practice, and humans of ecological restoration. I'm back in your ears with a new episode. I know you may not be leaving home much and just eating podcasts for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I have not served you up much during this middle-ish portion of the coronavirus pandemic, but get ready for some shows. If I wanted to be suave like everyone else, I would call this season 2 or something, but no, I'm going to keep it real. People published some books, I read some books, and I went on an interview rampage. So look forward to hearing some new voices coming up in the next few months. What else is new? I should remind you that treehuggerpod.com is up and running. In my spare time, I even made a Treehugger-inspired mixtape for you all. I will put a link to Spotify in the show notes. There are a lot of ironic songs about restoration, the sun, the earth, trees, and mountains. Some of the songs aren't my typical genre of music, but definitely Treehugger-inspired tunes. Yes, Dumb Thumbs is in there, and Marvin Gaye, and Kimya Dawson. Honestly, I got a little obsessed with it, and I hope you like it. What you are listening to was also edited with new software that, in theory, is making my dreams come true and making my process more efficient. I'm still getting used to it, so if some of the cuts and edits are a bit jerky, well, just shut up about it. At least I'm using my favorite microphone, which I think makes my voice sound a little extra smooth. It's all an experiment in adaptation. This episode delves into the intersections of climate change, community well-being, justice, and restoration of our urban ecosystems. The focus is on urban heat and the challenge of heat islands. My question to you to start things off: what is your favorite coping mechanism for a heat wave? Maybe we simply stay hydrated and wear light clothes. Maybe we put a wet towel on our neck. Take a cold shower before bed. Do we hang out in the shade and avoid the sunlight like a vampire? Some folks go to the water or forest or high country to experience some thermal comfort. We might head to the mall or movie theater and avoid going outside altogether. Some people may sit in front of their air conditioning unit and let the icy rush of air flow over themselves. All these coping tactics presuppose that we all experience heat stress at some point during our lives. Perhaps we even assume we are facing an unstable climate future where we don't meet the expectations of the most recent Paris Climate Accords and we don't pledge or fulfill our carbon neutral future. While my guest and I are definitely going to talk about climate impacts and urban heat in particular during this episode, I also want us to start manifesting the story about doing things right. That does not necessarily signify looking to the future for some magic technology to help us adapt. It may mean looking in disparate places to the past and present stewards of the earth, such as indigenous governance, as an adaptive climate change strategy. On this episode, I'm joined by Vivek Shandas, who is Professor of Climate Adaptation and Director of the Sustaining Urban Places Research Lab, SUPR, aka Super, I think, maybe, at the Portland State University. Dr. Shandas studies the effects of urban development patterns and process on environmental health. By examining the assumptions about our built environment, Dr. Shandas supports communities in improving their adaptation from climate stressors, including extreme events such as urban heat, air quality, and storms. Vivek also serves as chair of the City of Portland's Urban Forestry Commission and on several other local and national advisory boards. He is a tree hugger at heart, and I'm happy to have him on the show. I recorded this episode with Vivek virtually when our region in the West at large was blanketed with smoke in September 2020. These wildfires are making headlines because they are also urban fires, encroaching deep into the suburban wildland interface, and smoke knows no boundaries. Despite how they are ignited, all the conditions are there for fires to start. Summers are longer, hotter, and drier. Now, I am not endorsing some managed retreat for all those living on the edge of a wild forest. We all have exposure to climate change risks and impacts. Most of us are part of urban ecosystems, and we are exposed. We are in different ways sensitive to change, and we cope. Extreme heat is now, though. Everywhere around the world, heat waves are more frequent and lasting longer, and heat waves are becoming more frequent in cities. With 2020 on track to rank in the top 5 hottest years on record, it is getting really tough in our city's treeless and concrete neighborhoods. It's a worldwide story. Death Valley hit a record this summer. Baghdad topped an unprecedented 51 degrees Celsius. That's 125 degrees Fahrenheit. And parts of the Arctic burned. Global average temperatures are already 1 degree Celsius warmer than previous centuries. An average doesn't speak to what will be a dramatically unequal experience of future heat. Parts of the world have already warmed more than twice the global average today. That trend will leave more people vulnerable to extreme heat, which has already been linked to a 50% increase in mortality risk from stroke, cardiovascular disease, and pulmonary conditions. Some 12,000 people in the U.S. die prematurely from heat-related causes each year, a figure that could increase as much as 8-fold by the end of the century. But the hottest places at the end of this century don't face equally elevated mortality risk from extreme heat. The Climate Impact Lab found that future death rates are closely related to inequality and economic growth. Some research shows that heat affects our mood. Perhaps heat in part exacerbates overzealous policing, physical distancing on top of decades of racist neighborhood segregation, under-resourced schools, voter suppression, and the like. Wealth inequality will create madly different climate risks for citizens within the same country, within the same cities. Indigenous and Black people in the U.S. today suffer the highest heat-related death rates, respectively, from heat. That is one reason calls for climate justice to address the increased dangers faced by poor and minority populations have risen in parallel with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. I am so grateful to have had the chance to discuss these issues and more with Vivek Shandas. In this episode, we get into what is really lighting his fire right now and how his research and focus has changed over time. We define urban heat and urban heat events because it's not the same for everyone in different regions. So it's all fairly relative to where you are located on Earth and what you're really accustomed to. We frame heat as a human security issue and talk about our rights to a healthy and secure, stable climate. In so many ways, we talk about structural inequities across race, class, gender, and income levels that affect our ability to cope and adapt to urban heat. I did probe a little bit and ask him about communities that are getting it right, and his response kind of varied. It didn't seem like there was anyone that really got the gold medal for that. But we did talk about lessons learned for climate readiness and tactics that we could adopt to assist with restoration of degraded ecosystems in urban areas. And we talk about this summer's heat mapping campaigns. Vivek started this consulting company called Kappa Strategies, and there were more than a dozen cities this past summer that took part in street-level heat mapping campaigns, which gets people involved and invested in urban heat issues. The data that emerges out of it is illuminating, more precise and more fine detail than the data that comes out of mapping heat from the 10,000-foot level. So we do get into some of the more technical issues, but really we do keep some of that discussion at a very personal level. All right, sit back, put those earbuds in, take a walk or a stroll. Enjoy this discussion with Vivek Shandas.
I just mentioned we might have a little 10-year-old walk in and out of here every so often. He's at home and is going to probably access his little art cart over here.
Oh, Willie, that's fine. No problems. Kids in the background, that's totally fine. Mine actually, they left while the weather is good. They'll probably be back here in a little while. So
yeah, appreciate it. It was new to me. I like the Treehugger piece and writing the harkening back to some of the South Asia collective responses to taking down of trees. I thought was really apropos to how I've thought about it, and I've known the Chipko movement, and then even met some folks who were involved with it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's good. So if you have time, I will tell you, really the name came from, like I have parents and they're kind of know what I do for a living, You have like a kind of straightforward career. They're like, you plan cities. So as like a restorationist or a plant ecologist, that my dad, essentially, he just calls me a professional tree hugger. Right. So I was like, okay, great. And, it's like kind of offensive, but it's, really like if I lived in the 60s, maybe, like it being hippie or, with long hair or something, like maybe it would offend me, but my sensibilities are, I learned to live with it. So I was like, this is fine. I'll just take that moniker and just run with it. So trying to come up with a name for the podcast. Yeah, that makes sense. I like trees. That's my thing. And yeah, we'll just adopt it. But now that I've learned more about the origins of it, it's centuries old, right? And there's people that really, really indeed lost their lives for trying to protect trees and their way of life and their livelihoods, and really just their relationship with the earth and the trees was so important that they would just give up their lives. So I do need to give some nod to it at some point, a little bit deeper, because I don't fully understand. If you have any folks that you can recommend, I'd love to talk with them. Chipko.
Yeah, there's a guy who I've been in touch with named Madhav Gadgil, who's actually an academic out of Pune, the city of Pune. My family's originally from South India, and so I've been trying to do work in India for a while, and part of it has been connecting with some people who I've really admired. And one person, Madhav Gadgil, he's kind of a Gandhian in terms of philosophy, and he was been very instrumental in working with the concept of ecosystem services in India, and really bringing a lot of that with Gretchen Daly early in the day. Actually had a chapter in that 1997 book by Gretchen and company about ecosystem services. And he's been somebody I've followed for a long time. He's got a vast network, several of whom were involved in Chipko, several of whom involved with Vandana Shiva and that whole movement as well.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you just named some heroes of mine.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. There's some amazing folks there doing lifelong career folks that are so committed and intelligently advocating for the things that are hard to move in a big bureaucracy like in South Asia.
Thanks for acknowledging the Treehugger name.
That's cool.
Okay.
I mean, it's better. Your dad's name for you is way better than my dad's name for me in some ways.
Really? What is it?
My dad calls me an undisciplined scholar.
What?
Meandering, if a lot of the family, like they did what they were doing all the way through, from high school on to my parents' case, anyway, retirement. My brother kind of did very similar, but I've done this meandering path, going from undergraduate of biology and religious studies into economics and environmental policy into urban ecology and now into a lot more urban planning and community science type stuff. So it's a whole hodgepodge, and academics are so kind of precise about their area of contribution that I hold this much, and most academics are kind of trying to hone it down to a very fine application that they're doing. And so that's why my dad's kind of like, I don't exactly know what you do, but you're kind of a scholar and you're not really have a discipline that you can claim, so undisciplined scholar makes a lot of sense.
Maybe I haven't gotten so deep into your CV that I missed the spiritual studies. So you're a multifaceted individual. Well, I think that gives you sort of this more magnanimous view of the world. I think it serves you well, I think.
I hope so. I was looking at your questions, and one of the first things that jumped out was my favorite tree, of course. That jumps out all the time.
Sometimes I feel like I should put it at the beginning because it really helps to like break the ice, maybe. We could start with that one.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, that one actually gets back to a little personal story, just because I had a tree that it's kind of like the motto or the theme of a lot of things in my life have to do with this idea that just like the everyday thing suddenly brought to light, right? It's like, you think about the tree you walk by all the time to the bus stop, or you think about the plant that's growing on the edge between the sidewalk and the median strip. And like these things are just so often mundane, or just things that we have often either taken for granted or not taken at all. And so there's a tree in my backyard when I was growing up. It was a mango tree, actually. And
Ooh,
for some
lucky.
reason, yeah, it was in Bangalore in South India. And one of the things I remember was our terrace. I would be able to walk up the stairs on the side of the house, go to the terrace, and slink across from the wall of the terrace onto a branch of the tree. And with my right arm, I would kind of hook myself in, throw my left leg up, and I could pull myself onto the tree and then lounge there for hours. And after a while, I would start like scratching at the bark. I even probably gnawed at the bark a fair bit and just got really intimate with this tree. And it was one of those things where it's more of a personal connection than necessarily like an ecosystem service connection or anything like that. It's this kind of appreciation of a place where I could sit on hot days because it would get hot. It's a place I could be on days where I wasn't feeling good about my parents. It's a place I could go when I was just really wanting a little time alone. I mean, it served a lot of personal needs. And I still, when I go back there and try to find it, they've taken it down. After we moved from that house into an apartment complex, just before moving to the United States, there were these huge banyan trees on the side of the apartment complex. And there'd be monkeys that would go from the opposite. It wasn't me going onto the trees. It would be the monkeys coming from the trees into the apartments. And my mom would be in the apartment and the monkeys would jump up on the balcony with their perfectly opposable thumbs, open the screen door, and then crawl in and then go take stuff from the cupboards. And
oh man, those monkeys.
Yeah.
So mischievous.
Yeah, super naughty.
I think with fruit trees, you either love them or hate them to a certain extent. That's why I think they're not allowed as street trees in the U.S. in a lot of places because they just kind of create a mess. And I mean, we have a lovely old apple tree out in the backyard, and it's kind of a pain sometimes, especially like the early part of the season where the wind blows a little too hard and just throws the little ones off that aren't good for eating or anything. I think it's maybe the same thing with the mangoes. I was fortunate enough to be, when I was in the Peace Corps in Bolivia, my buddy, his site was down in Santa Cruz, which is in the part of the Amazonian part of the Bolivia. And yeah, he had a mango tree. I was down there for a couple different holidays. We just would hang out in the hammocks, and I remember maybe just having one meal a day and the rest was just mangoes. Like they'd fall on the roof. I know what you're talking about. I think they'd fall on the roof and just roll off.
Yep.
Like one of us would have to like stand up and like go get it and then just like peel it. That's where I learned how to cut. And actually my wife is kind of impressed I know how to cut mango, but it's an art form.
It is.
And you get them when they're a little not too ripe or a little too ripe. Yeah, they just mush all over the place.
They're amazing.
That's
especially
great.
Yeah, you get a South Asian talking about mangoes and you can have a whole conversation.
That's a fabulous tree. That's a great one. No one said that one yet. Yeah, like you said, I think you pad the everyday trees you pass by, particularly ones that are in people's yards or something like that, probably have a story for it as well, and it means something to them. Sometimes trees can be nuisances. I was just telling you about how the wind and just like there's a whole mess outside I just haven't dealt with because the morning's been pretty busy, but later on I'll take some enjoyment in it, but there's lots of leaves and there's like so many Doug fir cones out in the front yard. It's just nuts.
Right. That's when you notice them, right? During the big hazardous moments with lots of wind or during fall, you start, at least with the deciduous, you notice them a lot more. The mango tree was a mundane tree. Everyone walked by it. I imagine it's probably not that big a deal for a lot of folks, but we have millions of those trees in our cities, that we just walk by and don't even think twice about.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. It's a great story.
Yeah. Do you hear, my son's actually realized he has his piano lesson right now.
Oh, sure.
Do you hear that?
I hear a little bit in the background, just a tiny little. It might just be pleasant background.
Yeah, background music.
Yeah, it's good. He's just tuning it. He's just like getting started right now, right?
Yeah, he's just getting started. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I'm cool. It's like a theta waves or something.
Yeah, there you go.
Good. All right. Well, let's talk about heat. I feel like this is timely right now. I thought maybe having this interview in September, it might be like over, like summer might be over. But I don't know. It's not hot. I'm a Pacific Northwesterner, right? Once it breaks like 70, 75, I start to get a little hot.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's all kind of relative. So for other people in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, they're like, oh man, I'm just like, going to put a sweater
Yeah,
on or whatever. So I'm hoping to put this episode out sometime when people can appreciate it, because they're like, yeah, it is hot,
yeah,
instead of putting it out in the winter and people are like, oh, it's not a big deal.
yeah. It's not that big a deal,
And in
right?
Seattle, when it's like cloudy and 50, like no one cares about urban heat, but it
Right.
is a huge issue. And I've started to notice it a lot more. And I really enjoy reading some of your work and listening to you, and the perspective you bring to it. And just continue to gain to know you. I was interested in what you're really passionate about right now, and like what's really, no pun intended, what's lighting your fire,
Yeah,
and just
yeah.
how your research and focus of your work has changed over time. I think you alluded to it, talking about your dad and how your education has meandered. You've taken a very distinct path in life.
You never know what's going to happen around the corner often. And so I've approached things as if there's a general set of values and direction I'd like to go, though exactly what that looks like is often a mystery. And when it shows up, I generally know that it's showing up for a reason, and I spend more time investigating that. And so that's kind of at the 30,000 foot level, where there's certain things that resonate a little bit more profoundly than other things. And if I can quiet myself down enough to actually feel that resonance, then I know that it's the right thing that I'm doing. Often I clutter it up with doing things so fast that it's hard to know that I've actually just stumbled into a really interesting area of investigation, of reflection, of life that I often overlook it. And so that's where I think really after entering my 40s and into my late 40s now, it's the thing that is happening to me more than anything else is I'm able to tune into that resonance a bit more effectively than I ever had in my earlier years. And that has been, for me, a really important part of what's lighting my fire, because I'm trying to hone in on the things that are actually speaking to me in ways that have never spoken to me before, like history. I've really not been a student of history in my past. And yet this work that we did on redlining and looking at heat and its disproportionate exposure, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how can history not have been such an important factor in understanding the distributional effects and inequities that we're seeing today, not only in tree canopy, also in a bunch of other things that we see around our cities, around our regions. So it's that resonance, I guess, is that I'm really excited about. I didn't think I was going to even say that to you when I read this for the first time. I was thinking that's going to be about injustice and equity and the fact that Black Lives Matter is moving a whole discussion about race because the country has a big challenge with race. And, as an immigrant to the country, it's not something I necessarily inherited, but it's something that is part of my everyday experience. And so I went in excited and even optimistic about that possibility. And I frankly really am excited about it, though a little bit more, take that a little bit deeper for me into why that's the case. And it's really about recognizing that there are certain things that I've been able to tap into that resonate with me more so than I ever have before. And I don't know what that is. And so part of that excitement is really the mystery that's unfolding right in front of us, and trying to stay curious about it and trying to stay engaged with it and trying to stay present with it is really what I'm excited about and trying my hardest and darndest to do.
It really does shape how you move through life. And I've stumbled into some kind of mindfulness practice, and that's what it sounds like to me, is that if you're lucky enough or awake enough or mindful enough to recognize when opportunities come to you or when you should be pursuing an idea or exploring certain themes, that
Right.
you go after that. That's one of the better gifts you can receive in life, I think, really. And then I guess maybe to continue this little deep train of thought, I am wondering how you think your race and ethnicity plays into your literacy about climate and the approach you have for urban planning.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but I'll
Yeah.
summarize. I think for me, the most helpful thing has been recognizing that I am a pretty classically trained scholar, in that I feel like I did my homework, did my due diligence with the fields that I studied. I got to know their language. I got to know their methods. I got to know the epistemological foundations of the disciplines that I was really studying at the time, albeit it meandered a fair bit. Nevertheless, part of what I recognized was I haven't really brought my own identity into this work. It's often been kind of, what have the scholars said? How can I be a parrot with those scholars and, repeat what they said and put it in the context that I'm working on, except use the other scholarly approaches and what others have often said in their analyses. And I think that's well and good, and it works really well to get a PhD, and it works really well to get a college degree, is to do that kind of almost like you're recognizing them in your work, and therefore that is part of your work, is you're putting all this recognition of all the work that's happened before you. Though there comes a certain point where you're starting to say, whoa, wait, I have something to say about this. I actually have a voice about this. And that puts the mirror not necessarily onto the scholars and the people that are out there, but puts the mirror back on you and saying, wait, what is it that your unique contribution to this field is? And where I think you're getting me right now, Michael, is this point of last couple of years where that has happened in a very kind of intense way for me. And what has started coming up is my own identity has started showing up in my research. And that is the most challenging thing to have to deal with, because it was very easy to put other people's words in my mouth and just parrot that and just do fine, get a career, get a job, publish papers, blah, blah, blah. Though what I'm noticing is in the last couple of years, what's happening is that the identity has become much more defined, much more clear. And that has created a transformation and a discomfort of trying to figure out how that's going to articulate in a way that's really authentic and really contributes and provides some service. And so that part of that identity is who I am. And that has a lot to do with where my family's from in India, how that has defined my perspectives in the world, how that's constrained my perspectives in the world, how that's opened up certain avenues, and how that's closed other avenues. And so part of where my place here is that as an immigrant also to the United States, a lot of the conflict between what was going on in terms of the founding of the country, the slavery that was foundational for building the country, the pushing and the reservationing of indigenous and First Peoples in the country, all of that was like, wait, I don't have a history there, do I? But then all of a sudden when I look at myself, I come from a post-colonial country, and there are a lot of these similar issues that are very tied up to how Indians and South Asians see Europe and the colonial empires that have been very central to the creation of the identity of South Asia today. And so what I've done in this process is unpack some of that. And that's in this particular time where Black, Indigenous, people of color have a bit more of a voice than I have experienced, at least in my own lifetime. And that voice is being at least brought out through a variety of different expressions. I'm feeling a lot more comfortable in that transformation that's happening within me. And part of the work is finding its way in papers that are trying to bring more of the kind of cultural and human and social dimensions of the work more centrally in the classically trained analysis that I've been indoctrinated in. And so while I can do the stats and I can do the GIS and I can do this stuff, that has often been removed from those more, I think, personal aspects of who I am and why this matters to me and what my voice is in all of this. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's where my race, ethnicity, at least is starting to now transform and become more central to the way that I'm talking about this stuff and writing about this stuff.
That makes sense to me. I thank you for being able to feel comfortable enough to tell me about that. The colonialism and its aftermath and the footprint it's left all over the place, really, it's left this huge legacy, particularly with our interaction with the environment, the way the climate crisis right now, and then with how racism is so deep-seated and how segregated we are. Definitely, you touched on a lot of different things. I really thank you for like speaking your voice because it does show through and it does have value. I just want to tell you that for
I
sure.
appreciate that. Yeah.
And the other thing is, I thought about this earlier. Another acquaintance I have in academia talked about imposter syndrome. And I know this is not my skill set. I'm not a therapist. And I don't know if we talked to our own therapists about this, but just that feeling that you have to always be proving yourself and you have to put on a certain mask to a certain extent. To a lot of us have fears and that we have to act certain ways, and that's dictated by our family or how we move through life, how we're our race or ethnicity and socioeconomic status, a lot of different things. Imposter syndrome is real, I think, in academia for sure, right?
Oh, couldn't agree more. I mean, showing up in a university setting where you don't look like the folks who are there, that is a very clear, immediate. I mean, that's what humans have. They have the visual, they have the interpretive of the visual. And so that's where the unchecked implicit biases are there. That's been pretty much my lifetime. I've experienced that throughout. And the way that I've found to manage that is through humor, is through kind of doing my best in projects and showing that I can, showing up, overcommitting. I mean, all the kind of stuff. So
just working extra hard, just beating yourself up, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's all there, but it's also one of those things that from you take the kind of immigrant thing, and one of the things that my parents or my family and I have talked about a lot is just how incredibly hard one has to work to kind of prove themselves, to kind of show up and be there. And so my dad came in, my mom came in. I mean, they were tireless in their work, and my dad probably worked 52 years continuously and probably took 2 weeks of break, in that time. And I just don't have that in me, but he has that ability. And it takes a toll definitely on his health and well-being, but nevertheless, that's kind of what it takes to make it in his perspective. So My brother and I both have that in us in many respects, for better or for worse. And it's like that fits well with the like imposter syndrome, because it makes you, bust your butt in terms of trying to work harder and do more.
Some of those guys live a long time, but I don't know if it means anything for their actual like health span, really, So
right.
I think it's shared by white folks alike too, really. It's like everyone has it.
Yeah, right.
But it manifests in so many different ways and comes out in very inappropriate, spontaneous ways as well.
It kind of winds into the heat question in some ways too.
Yeah, it's talking about heat, the focus of our discussion today. I wish you could define urban heat and urban heat events for us. And because I think it does mean different things to different people. And then what do you think are the prominent stresses that heat imposes on different communities? And who do you think is the most vulnerable in the urban ecosystem?
So heat's something we all know about. Our bodies have to stay at a particular temperature in order to be healthy. And so very similarly, I think a lot of our places, whether we're talking about cities or forests or ag lands, they've all been designed, if you will, with a particular boundary of heat in mind. And so it doesn't get above this, it doesn't get below this. So this particular set of crops are ideal for this. It rains this much, it doesn't rain that much. So our operating approach to a lot of what we do in the world is based on a set of assumptions that are historical in nature and that are geographic in nature. And so a heat event then would be something that would be outside of those boundaries that we anticipate, that we expect, that we've planned around, that we've designed for. And so a heat event then becomes much more of a condition that is an anomalous condition, something that's outside of a boundary that we've expected. And that can mean above a 90-degree day for the Pacific Northwest. It can mean above a 100-degree day in the Pacific Southwest. And so what we're really getting at is geographic differences. And it might mean above an 80-degree day in Florida, except with 90% humidity. And so it varies quite a bit by region, and it's really based on kind of what are the norms, expectations, and historical conditions that we've all come to recognize as cool or hot or what have you. So, you were talking about your sweater condition, it's like, yeah, that totally makes sense.
I've got a full set of
Yeah.
hoodies and fleeces and Gore-Tex and everything.
Yeah, like we say out here, right? No bad weather, just bad equipment.
Yeah.
But it's like, and it's physiologically, we get trained in that too, physiologically. Like the stories about, recent story about some kids in Thailand who went up into the mountains from very tropical, warm environment, and the temperature dropped to about 65 degrees, and they literally froze to death overnight. And so 65 for me, I'd be like, I'm in shorts and t-shirt. I'm doing okay if it's like that over the night.
Yeah.
But our bodies aren't, often don't thermoregulate in those conditions that are really outside of our coping capacity. That gets us into kind of both a personalized definition of heat, a kind of a regional definition of heat, and a planetary definition of heat, right? So we're really talking about a heat event as being something that can, yes, be measured and calculated and characterized. Those often translated into how our individual physiology responds to that. And that's the way I tend to think about it. And we're seeing that with trees in terms of their ability to grow in specific environments, and that they're evolutionarily adapted over millennia to be growing in these particular kinds of environments. Though, as we know, if it becomes long, the summers are longer, more intense, more frequent in terms of outside the boundary of heat or temperatures, then those particular species will be far more vulnerable. And we're finding that. Actually, we are finding that in terms of their turgor pressure, their stomatal gas exchange, their hydraulic conductivity. Like, we can measure these things in terms of a stress that a tree would undergo in these conditions. And what's great about some of the urban work we're doing is we can take a tree that's the same age, same species in one part of the city that's exposed to 100-degree days over a summer for several days, and then take another tree, same age, same species, same structural characteristics, and look at the differences in those trees and get a whole bunch of species, a whole bunch of replicates, if you will, and start testing to see how they're performing on hot days and how they're responding to the heat. And it turns out that these trees that are in hotter areas are far more stressed in almost every single one of the measures we can calculate. And that suggests that limb failures or entire structure itself failing could be an indication that there's these stresses that various species would probably be more prone to than others. So heat event kind of has that effect on ecosystems. On people, it's very similar. It's like, unless we have a cooling resource, it's really hard for our bodies to be able to cool down, especially if we hit that threshold of about 37 Celsius or 98.6. And if we're not able to sweat, our body starts heating up and our organs start to fail. Very similar to what would happen to another living species of a tree. And so the communities that have been consistently affected are those that often have been historically either segregated from areas that could be cooler with parks or street trees or things like that, or have been actively disinvested in with lack of, central AC in buildings, or lack of materials that could actually cool the buildings and their residents down, lack of ventilation to actually move air through to keep things cool if they don't have AC. So there's been active disinvestment and real clear indication that is starting to play an important role in the excess mortality and morbidity we're seeing during heat waves. And they tend to be older adults, often lower income, often communities of color, Black, Indigenous, urban populations that are affected the hardest. And any people with pre-existing health conditions and things like any asthma or wheeze or any COPD issues are often also consistently identified as folks who experience heat stress, heat stroke, and sometimes fatalities.
Mm-hmm. That's right. My mom actually has COPD, and on certain days she just doesn't go outside. And then she's fortunate enough now to be in a house that has AC, so she can just ride it out. And living during these COVIDian times, right? During coronavirus, the summer's not over, and I don't think we've actually seen the full outcome of it, because, like, those cooling centers are not open, right? Like the malls weren't open for a while. Like you think of like the hottest place they actually were in my neighborhood or my city is like the mall where most people go, like the movie theaters, the mall.
Yep.
Right. And like outside, those are like the hottest places, but inside, they're probably the places where you can find the most thermal comfort. So
Right.
libraries are closed, cooling centers are just not around. I expect people were really suffering or dying really this summer. And I was just reading an article in New York. There's a group that took it into their own hands, and they were actually they just had like water spraying, so people just neighborhood little units on the end of the block where people could just go and just hang out. If you don't have AC, you have to escape outside, and then you're put into a challenging position where you could effectively be infected by the virus if you're in close proximity to a lot of people.
Right.
It's kind of a double-edged sword, or I don't know what that cliche is, but it's bad news. It's bad news.
Right. And even people who have AC, like the fact that it's very expensive to run. It's in the short term helpful for you to stay well. It's very expensive to run in the long term. And it's also, of course, depending on where your fuel source comes from, it can really affect the long term of climate and the challenges that got us into this trouble in the first place.
From the sustainability perspective, and not everyone can own AC and think that humanity can survive. I used to think we were so fortunate living in the Pacific Northwest and sort of ecotopia, where it's not so hot, not so cold, but really east side of the mountains is very different. It's super hot, and it's tough to live over there without cooling. Thinking about this then as like more of a human security issue, I did catch upon this notion, and this woman is actually an Eskimo, wrote this book. Her name is Sheila Cloutier. She wrote this book a while ago. I haven't read it, but I watched a few videos of her. She talked about the right to be cold. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that notion that we have a human right to be cold, and with climate change, with urban heat, we're actually violating that right of ours.
That's fascinating. I love the way that it's actually based in indigenous knowledge and kind of thinking about the idea that there is a right to be ultimately safe and well, right? The cold aspect, ultimately it's about safety and health for a community, and the role that heat and cold plays really becomes essential. And so like what we do with food and our farm bill subsidies, the idea is to create very affordable food, even though most of it is highly processed and probably not very healthy in the long run for communities when you're talking about the most inexpensive food that a lot of communities have access to, in part because it's subsidized. I think part of this is also like, how do we create an environment that's healthy for us to live in, and what rights do we or anybody in a particular place and with constitutional rights to be able to pursue life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, what are the ways in which the structures would enable that safety and healthful living to occur? And if we've come to recognize that above a certain temperatures it's unhealthy, then we know that we have to find ways to be able to create cooler environments. We know that that becomes a fundamental way of maintaining health and safety in a community. So climate change has been identified as a security threat because it's going to destroy buildings, it's going to destroy infrastructure, it's going to destroy the things that enable humans to cohabitate together in a space. And so if heat does the same, and in fact, we know that heat adds another level of social disruption, meaning that when it's hot, there are a lot more reports of road rage, a lot more hospitalizations, a lot more accidents, a lot more violence and physical aggression and things like that. And so we see that temperature has a direct effect on our health and well-being individually. We also see that our brothers and sisters are also a little upset about it and will, affect our health and well-being as a result. So heat is one of those really interesting intersectional concepts that, without even knowing it, is affecting our health and well-being, and is often, I think, undervalued because we've all experienced a hot day or an anomalous hot day. And so from a security point of view, I think it's a very interesting argument. It's not one I've spent a great deal of time developing, though the right to cold is something that I think right to being cool is the right to being safe and healthy. And if that's a way we could frame this to be able to bring national security resources to this, then by all means, I think it's a necessity. Like Middle East, there are air conditioning sidewalks, Lockheed Martin engines that essentially are blowing cool air as you're walking outside. And so that air, of course, just goes away and becomes hot in a few moments. Wow. But the fact that I'm walking under it and can experience that cool is I can stay outside. Yeah. We can throw an inordinate amount of resources at being able to maintain that level of comfort, though fundamentally we might have to start asking ourselves, I think in the long run, like, are these places that we're living really habitable as we see temperatures really start to reach into the 50 Celsius, 55 Celsius marks?
That is just excruciating. 50 degrees Celsius. I don't even know. I can't even conceive of that. I think it's just worth exploring, just thinking about, but it was framed in just a way as far as our rights to a quality environment. In very few instances, maybe a few states have some piece of their constitution embedded in, but I don't think it's enforced. Really in any way. Are there any communities out there getting it right? Or are there any lessons learned for climate readiness or philosophy or tactics or tools that others should adopt to assist restoration of degraded ecosystems in a warming world? If there's any getting it wrong, you could just call them out too, if you want.
The air conditioning is getting it wrong. Like, that's really, it's such a tactic of desperation and a attempt to show, yes, we can continue living in this place. Don't think about leaving. Because cities are ultimately, they're trying to get people and they want to hold on to people. That's what is the essential, not only design, but I think even conceptualization and even attempt to maintain a level of urbanity or a level of urbanism that allows humans to essentially find the cultural, find the economic, find the social ways of interacting and being in packs, which I think humans are much like dogs that way. They really like to be social and engage with one another. And so what heat can do, and what pandemic has been really illustrative, is it can really kind of separate us. It can really create a lot of physical distancing, maybe even to a certain extent social distancing as well. And so a big part of what I'm thinking about getting it right is really about how have cities enabled people to come together still, even with a warming world? How have they brought ecosystems and any principles of ecology to supporting people coming together? And I think this is not like a rocket science solution in the sense of like, it doesn't require a great deal. I think we've been doing this all along. I think historically, a lot of indigenous cultures have lived in very hot places for millennia and been able to sustain themselves over time. And so it's not necessarily a new thing that a place is doing for climate readiness. I think as a species, we've always been climate ready. It's about how do we harness those practices, those experiences to be able to enable society to continue cohabitating like they have. And so I guess I would go to Southeast indigenous communities that have figured out ways to live in very hot, oppressive climates for a very long time. I would go to communities that have been in the Middle East for a very long time, where they've found architecture, found materials, found ways to be able to allow the movement of air and movement of each other, so that there is a lot less of that stagnant air, that heating air, and that constant absorbing of heat that re-radiates out and makes it even hotter. And so part of the solution in getting it right, I think, fundamentally comes down to what are the philosophies that a lot of indigenous communities have used to enable them to continue living in a place that for you and I might be really intolerable because of the climate impacts. And so rather than creating this massive air conditioning amphitheater where people can gather and be cooled off, I really think there are many of these practices that have been around for millennia that I think we need to start thinking about a little more seriously. So again, an example where my race, or at least my ethnicity and race and my connection to a very indigenous old culture comes to play in this work is my response to that question, right? If I were from Europe, or if I were from parts of Germany, people I've talked to, even though it's an old and culture, there is a big focus on technology, trying to figure out what the latest and greatest for this is. And the modern world is much built around that. And I think that's more a reflection of our economic system than really our ability to cope.
Do you see a distinction between coping and adapting? Is that a big distinction? Because like coping is just sort of like you don't necessarily acknowledge it, or you don't really think about it when you're just like coping. It's like it's a hot day, I'm gonna go in the shade. Adapting, I guess, requires maybe some foresight. I don't know how you distinguish those in your mind.
I teach a climate resiliency planning graduate seminar, which is a lot of fun because we get to explore these kinds of definitional things a lot.
Yeah.
One of the things that we do is I came up with a kind of a graph. I'll kind of do it here where it's two axes, essentially like the X and Y axes. And we talk about it in terms of one axis, like the Y axis, the up and down. At the bottom end of that axis would be the individual, and at the top end would be society. So it's kind of like a scale, right, from bottom to top of individual society. And then on the x-axis, on the left, far left, right by the individual would be short term, and on the right side of that would be the long term. And we start thinking about what are particular tactics that people are using, what are practices that people are using that would fall into this set of individual, short term, all the way to societal and long term. And what I've noticed is coping strategies often are individual and short term, and that adaptation strategies are often long-term and societal. Mm-hmm. And that's just a kind of a rubric of sorts that I've used to help kind of guide and kind of characterize what are the ways in which each thing that we're doing can fit into a conceptualization of whether we're doing this just for ourselves by getting a window unit of AC, which is an individualized, short-term kind of a solution, or thinking about an entire infrastructure grid system that could create community solar that would drive a lot of renewable energy for a community to be able to gather in a cool space, which is a much more long-term adaptive kind of a strategy that allows socializing as part of that adaptation strategy.
That helps me. I've started doing lately, I don't know if you didn't ask me this, but I've started doing like cold showers. Actually, I live close to Puget Sound. It's like 10 minutes down the hill. Wow. Or like, a 10-minute jog or like a 10-minute drive. The Puget Sound is like 50 some odd degrees year round. So it looks crazy. And there's like open water swimmers, but there's this whole history. Warm water was not a thing for so long. It was for just like this little bit of our history, right? So cold water was just so important, and it works wonders for hormone regulation. I think you get this burst of dopamine. It feels really good. I mean, it at the beginning, it's awful. It's like the worst feeling for swimmers. And I grew up swimming on a lake and such, so I'm kind of used to being cold. But yeah, aversion to cold in the face of climate change, we got to get used to being cold. Yeah, so like first thing in the morning, first thing at night before you jump in bed, it helps.
Wow, that's really good.
Coping mechanism, yeah. So it's like called cold thermogenesis. There's like a whole biohacking thing about it now. It's coming back into vogue.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the cold dip. I mean, I'm naturally run hot, so cold showers are I'm a big fan. Cold. What do they call cold plunges?
Yeah, cold plunges. Yeah. I've actually never gone like super cold, like icy. I think someday that's maybe what I'm aspiring to do. But we were just on vacation. I just jumped straight on one to Fuka. So it's great. Feels good. Really... It's like getting back, decolonizing myself. Going back a few years now, I did hear about you because I volunteered and didn't go down for several years, but I did volunteer as part of the Seattle King County heat mapping campaign. Oh, cool. And it just happened like a month ago, I guess, right? Yep. So I volunteered and to drive a route through downtown Seattle with this thing, like this sensor on my vehicle. And during a heat event, it was pretty warm. I think it was like mid 80s, I think. Like it was August. It was one of the first like warm days
Right.
in Seattle anyway. There's like 15 routes, 15 neighborhoods, a lot of them in Seattle. So it took me about an hour to drive this whole thing. So I've heard you were behind this, right? And I'd actually known about it too because I'd seen some presentations, some data analysis about previous heat mapping campaigns in Portland and in Tacoma. So I've been sort of fascinated by it. And we actually, for whatever reason, it didn't go down the last couple of years in Seattle because it wasn't warm enough or logistics weren't right or whatever. But I was finally I was pleased to be a part of it finally this year. So I got to see it in action, but I understand it was also being carried out in other cities throughout the US. And so I am interested in if you could just tell us which cities this summer carried out heat mapping campaigns and what is the benefit of kind of crowdsourcing it or using community scientists?
Yeah. For this question, I'll probably switch from wearing my Portland State University hat to the consultancy that I actually run called Kappa Strategies.
Noted. I've got it. Yeah. Since we're on the podcast too, I'll explain to everybody. So he took off one hat and he put on this very elegant consultant hat.
Yeah, it has a lot less gray in it.
Yeah. All right. Got it.
My Portland State University, a lot more gray and a lot more disheveled. But yeah, this campaign thing started a decade ago or more. We were essentially experimenting with what could be possible in terms of instrumentation and analytics. And it was a very wonky like research exercise. And it slowly started dawning on me that the fact that we have communities that are just not paying attention to things that are happening immediately in and around their neighborhoods. And what is it that we need to do? And so through the university, I tried really hard to get communities to do this, and it wasn't as easy to do through the university. And so part of my lack of sleep from thinking about climate change that occasionally happens to me wanting to do something about it and the university not being able to necessarily provide the capacity to be able to do it. The consultancy was born a couple of years ago to do this work, and it allows it to be done at much less cost and much more scalable. And so part of what we're trying to do is really get communities engaged in this work. And it's a fee-for-service consultancy form where, we can work with any community to essentially train up a group of community groups or a community group, ideally from communities that haven't really participated in things that are climate related or things that are environmental even. Maybe it's a social justice group, maybe it's a housing group or something like that. And we involve that community to go out and collect these temperature and humidity readings. And this year we've done quite a few this year. It's been scaling up. And this year we've done a total of 15, which has been great. And they vary from Northeast to Southeast to Midwest. The Rocky Mountains are conspicuously missing, but Texas, New Mexico, and then the West Coast. So we have a really good set of community partners who we work with to be able to go out and collect these hundreds of thousands of temperature and humidity readings. And then we use a set of open source analytical platform to essentially to analyze the data and to provide these continuous maps of neighborhoods and down to the individual household even. So we get these very high resolution descriptions of temperature and humidity, and that allows us to characterize where it's hottest, where it's coolest, and then of course who's living there, who might be most vulnerable to those heat waves when in one neighborhood it's 90 degrees, in another neighborhood could be 105 degrees. And so we've seen that kind of variation in cities, and we've noticed that it really helps kind of target interventions, specific areas. And so if an area is really hot, it has very little canopy, it has a lot of communities that may have pre-existing health conditions or no AC or something like that, we can start thinking about what does that mean for cooling a neighborhood and being a little bit more deliberate and intentional in our applications. That's been really helpful for me. I still don't sleep at night, a lot better than I did before I started doing some of this work. And it's
all right. People's climate anxiety manifests in different ways about different things.
Exactly. And the most amazing thing is watching people as they look at these outputs and they're like, I had one example where a younger participant who was living in a historically redlined, disinvested neighborhood is essentially looking at a map and saying, oh my goodness, wait, you're telling me that my house is 15, 17 degrees hotter than my friend's house just a mile away? And saying, yep, that's what that map would say. It's like, wait, that's not right. Why is that? The moment they start asking why, I know they're starting to ask more fundamental questions about what went to make this pattern and who was involved with it. And then it slowly manifests into a question of injustice. And that's where it really starts to kind of grab people's interest in saying, wait, decisions were made without me to put me in this situation. And now I have to sweat and pay my electricity bill so much more than my friend does, and et cetera, et cetera. So those kinds of, I've had so many, innumerable number of those moments where people are just like, aha, wait a minute, this is really something I never expected and I never knew about. And those are the folks we really want to bring on board. And that's why the community science side of it is really important for us, is that it does, I think, not only at the individual level manifest, it also translates into more of a systemic question of what can we do and how can we all be involved.
All right. So I do have this little tech question. Well, I have some other thoughts about the things you said, but the tech question, traditionally we've measured temperature, like land temperatures via like Landsat, like the satellite beams, satellite beams down and like collects temperature somehow, like Star Trek. And then the difference between this was like street level data that's collected in these sensors on the bike or on the vehicle that you toot around the neighborhood with. So I feel like it's just finer detailed data, right, related to it. So what you thought was the difference, which was great, between neighborhoods, like now I feel like it's going to be even more pronounced, right? Perhaps.
Yeah. Right. I mean, like we were talking about the smoke earlier, like smoke moves around. It doesn't look at boundaries, similar to air in general. And so when you're looking at satellite imagery, you're looking at pixels that essentially have a particular energy in that pixel. And that energy is essentially gained from all the solar radiation that's hit that spot. What happens with that spot of energy where, let's say it's an asphalt road and the sun's hitting it? What the satellite is picking up is all that long wave radiation coming up off of it. And it can essentially describe differences. And what we're seeing often are rooftops. And the satellite's so far away, it's also doing it at much more coarse measurements. Like those pixels are really big. And so as opposed to doing the ground level measurements, which we can get really, really precise. And we don't get rooftops. We're getting what you, I, and a tree would experience as we're walking or rolling around. The other thing that we've noticed is that trees, often when you look at from satellite, that tree is going to be much hotter when you hug it than if you're seeing it from a satellite. The satellite would tell you, oh, it's actually, one of the coolest places, as opposed to when you're driving or riding your bike by it or even walking by it, the stem, trunk, and the understory, as well as a lot of the lower parts of that tree are incredibly hot. And if it's hot, that means a lot of the soil moisture is probably lost. And so that tree is going to be likely to be far more vulnerable because of the fact that it's much hotter, yet the satellites are saying it's all good. In most cases, we can get into the whole hyperspectral side, technical side, where we can use various different spectral signatures to look at the health of that tree, but that's not what we're...
So I can imagine, like one lone tree could be way more exposed, surrounded by impervious surface than like a grove of trees,
right.
Which is often like some legislation that cities are considering right now, particularly like Seattle, thinking about significant trees, which includes a definition of groves and protection of trees of a certain size, as well as a collection of trees. So is it 4? Is 4 a grove? Or is 6 a grove? Is 12 a grove, right? But functionally for cooling the city, I mean, the more trees in one spot, the better.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and the proximity to water as well is interesting. I saw some research, a graduate thesis from the University of Washington. This woman considered Seattle, and where I am too, in Tacoma and the Puget Sound, where the lakes are, really has some effect as well. So you see those edges, closer you are to the water, the cooler it is. But then you get into those centralized areas or neighborhoods away, just a couple miles away, or even like half mile away, and it's dramatically warmer.
Right. And in fact, Seattle is not one of the cities that I would think has it's true, has a big bank of buildings that actually prevent that cool air from the sound to come into the neighborhoods. But there are many cities that build these like ocean view or sea view, lake view perspective buildings that basically block all that amazing cool air coming off of the water surface. And yet the neighborhoods just on the other side of the buildings are just baking because those buildings have, in effect, stopped any of that convective current coming off of the water that has historically cooled. And that's back to the indigenous practices of knowing that you create more of a tiered system so that the wind can be used as effective cooling. And so really building with what you know about that landscape is not something that we're doing a great deal of right now.
Exactly. So I would expect to see, in which I think you've already proven in a paper you all published in January, I believe, of this year with Jeremy Hoffman in this paper that came out. I think it's spectacular. It's called The Effects of Historical Housing Policies on Resident Exposure to Intra-Urban Heat, a study of 108 U.S. urban areas. And what I've done is sort of manually, but I think you can overlay historically redlined neighborhoods and then, the heat data on top of that, and poof, what we sort of already know on the ground is that race essentially is a determinant of how hot it is in the city or in these neighborhoods. And then you can see differences in neighborhoods that maybe weren't redlined or more affluent now. It's fascinating, but it does sort of prove what you feel.
Yeah, it was surprising, frankly. It was actually surprising when we first saw the results, and because they were 94% of the cities were very consistently, the red line areas were consistently hotter by several degrees than their non-red line counterparts. And then, like, after 30 seconds of being surprised, it was like, duh, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been a systematic pattern that has played out, and heat is just one indicator. It's like a spider web. You pull on one of the strands and you see the whole thing move. And it's like heat is just one of those strands when in fact there's been just decades of disinvestment that have happened in neighborhoods as a result of a lot of redlining, racial covenants, various other forms of segregation that had been in cities for a long time. Redlining basically codified it at the federal level and allowed cities to come up with these plans where they can kind of really provide a lot of resources to the privileged and keep those from the not privileged, in a sense. And so the heat was just an indicator of a lot of things, not only systemic racism that was in play, but also disinvestments in education and healthcare and parks and recreation and just the myriad of things that cities can provide. And heat is just the resulting byproduct of all of this historical disinvestment that's happened. And that, to us, has been really illuminating, because the reason it's hot is largely because these huge freeways get put in neighborhoods that are like that, or these big box stores, or these big box stores, or these massive public housing complexes or industries. These are all things that got put into areas that weren't considered green lined or weren't considered, best neighborhoods, so to speak, for investment. These were the things that all these lesser desirable land uses would end up in. And so while communities continue living there or even adjacent to those areas where you still can feel the intense heat kind of coming off the surfaces. And so that study was just a start. It's a correlational study, and it's something that just opened up, hopefully, eyes for people. And ours isn't the first. There are many of these that are coming out. We just happen to do this across a lot of cities and finding a very clear pattern. But it's really one of those things that just needs a lot more digging into. Like, why did Tacoma do it this way? What was going on in the 30s and before to end up with this particular pattern? And how does that pattern play out today when groups like Tacoma Trees, which I know you're involved with, and other groups, it's like, how can we really bring that into our work planning? How can we really bring that into centering historically disinvested communities in the work that we're doing? Because ultimately, where I'd like to go with this, and this is probably the most provocative thing I'll say on this particular conversation, is we can, if we want, if I had legal and some econometric help, I can calculate the level of loss to communities economically because of this particular segregation policy and the effect that it's had on communities over a long period of time. So we can get into conversation about whether we call it reparations, whether we call it other forms of economic remuneration. Like, there is a whole host of impacts that have happened over generations that are now far more acute because of these climate stressors that many of the communities that are still living in the red line neighborhoods are experiencing. And so it becomes a really insidious process.
And I can imagine just lost IQ points and missing days of school, missing days of work, the deep economic impacts, and just loss of American creativity and go-getterism, that sort of thing, and just our place in the world.
Right.
The footprint is pretty lasting.
I mean, I think the movement is fundamentally, none of this is really about the campaigns. The campaigns are a means to be able to show things people already know often, and it helps with getting political support for it. They also help to illustrate that these patterns are very persistent across places where we go. And so a bigger part of this is really the movement of how do we center the communities? How do we engage communities? How do we heal from the historical disinvestment that's happened? And how can each one of us find avenues to engage communities that have not been brought into the discussions about what happens in a neighborhood, what happens to a school, what happens to a healthcare center? How do we have those conversations? And each community is going to be very unique, very idiosyncratic, very complex in the way that the stakeholders are going to engage in these conversations. And some you could just come in with big issues of reparation and start having that conversations. Other ones you can be like, well, it is getting hotter, isn't it? Oh, it's not. Well, it's feeling a lot hotter, and you can kind of try it through not necessarily as politically charged of a conversation. And so there's going to be different sensitivities, different tactics, but I think the pressure has to be consistent. I think it has to be relentless. And I think it really has to be grounded in this notion of how we have many of us, including me, been privileged in ways that we don't even know, while other communities are even struggling to find a way to meet basic needs. And so fundamentally, I feel like that conversation's been going on for a long time, and some of these maps and campaigns and the climate stressors are starting to bring some light into the importance of all of this. Not to mention the pandemic, which has also highlighted the inequities that are playing out. So in terms of getting in touch, I'm pretty much of an introvert. I do these kind of conversations in part because they help me clarify my thinking, connect with new people who I appreciate the work that you're doing, for example. I like to have conversations with people, but I also am kind of really cautious about that, my own time and my own kind of capacity.
We'll offer each other a lot of grace, obviously, because school's starting again, and we're still in the middle of at least one or two pandemics, and a lot of things are going on, so we can respect each other's space.
Yeah, we'll do a plug for the campaigns. Like, that's always a way to connect. It's always like people have taken that, and now we're doing an industrial land. Industrial land has an exemption in Portland. These are different ways that you can engage in the work. Industrial land has an exemption for the tree code that City of Portland has, Title 11 tree code. And it turns out I'm having a meeting later today about why that was put in place and what that means to the adjacent communities, what that means in terms of heat. And so there are very specific policies that some of the work is helping to move forward and to help inform. And there's other more general climate action planning policies for entire regions that some of the work is helping to move forward. So I'll put a plug in for the campaigns and kind of really actively doing the climate preparedness and adaptation planning that I think we all need to be involved with. And that conversation can take many different avenues.
Cool. And I'll link to it, to Kappa Heat Strategies and some of your work, and as well as a few other resources I think are appropriate or worth people looking into. So this is great. Thank you so much for getting very personal, but also very technical. And I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. This is great service that you're doing, and doing it on the side is just really says a lot about your passion and your commitment to this work.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for finding Treehugger Podcast again. Much love to Vivek Shandas for spending some time with us. I encourage you to peruse his scholarship. There are some links right now you can click on in the show notes, and please check out the Treehugger website if you haven't already. Treehuggerpod.com is now live to listen, download the shows, read about the guests, and catch some of the bonus material. And let me know what you think about it. I'm so glad to get this episode out there. Honestly, I've been obsessing about heat islands all summer, especially leading up to the Seattle-King County heat campaign. This isn't my specialty, but I hear it is therapeutic to talk about eco-anxiety and climate anxiety. Instead of keeping it all inside or just pushing it deeper down, if you don't have anyone to talk to about it, I want you to know you are not alone, and there are other folks out there who will listen. Perhaps getting involved with a like-minded activism group would help. I've been thinking about that lately. Although I have been in therapy before, I did not speak to my counselor too much about how my thoughts about ecological doom intruded on my quote-unquote general anxiety. In retrospect, it could have been helpful, but it is complicated. I just listened to the most recent Climate Ready podcast, and they hosted a Seattle-based therapist who somewhat specializes in climate anxiety. There's no shame in checking out his website, climateandmind.org. I'll put a link in the show notes and on the website. There you can find a list of resources to peruse or pass along to your own therapist. There are also remote options for counseling sessions these days. Everyone needs a little help, particularly when we are mourning the old normal. The next episode of Treehugger Podcast is about China's environmental gains and challenges with Ife Li and Judith Shapiro. Their new book, China Goes Green, just published. You can pick up a copy from Polity Books. Again, link at the website. Judith is a former professor of mine and a longtime scholar on Chinese issues related to the environment. She teamed up with Ife Li, an environmental studies professor at NYU Shanghai, to document and critique what it means for the future of the planet when one of the world's most durable, authoritarian governance systems pursues ecological civilization. This book explores both promises and risks of China going green, and here's a sample from the discussion.
Oftentimes, the tendency, especially in some English language outlets, to project China as a monolith. Sometimes it's projected as the country with these complex, deep cultural roots that can teach the West about how to live, about the art of war, about calligraphy, about all these sophisticated things. But at other times, there's the tendency to project China as this rising power that people should be scared of, right? This rising dragon that you don't seem to understand at all. Well, neither strikes me as accurate simply because China is complicated. China has many peoples. China has many different socioeconomic classes, just like the United States, just like Germany, just like every other country on the planet. And we have to recognize that whatever the Chinese government does, there are many other social groups. There are different scientists. There are different college students that are doing things that may or may not align very well with what the Chinese government wants. It's just a complex country, and we should resist the tendency to reduce that to a one-dimensional description of goodness or badness.
Thanks to the Seattle band Dumb Thumbs for providing our theme song. You can find all of their tunes at dumbthumbs.bandcamp.com. Take a look at my Spotify Treehugger mix as well. They are in there with some other great artists. I'm Michael Yadrick, and this has been another episode of Treehugger Podcast. Make sure you subscribe to the show so we show up in your feed. It would be cool if you can drop a short review of the show too. It will help other people find it. Then, of course, you all can keep up to date with the show at the new website, treehuggerpod.com, and all the socials at treehuggerpod. Thanks for listening. Get your dose of sunshine every day, but stay cool out there. See you next time.